Hello, I'm Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University, and this brief video lecture today is on poetry and interpersonal processes using poetry to facilitate empathy. This is the fourth lecture in a series of lectures that have been developed for a class on poetry, healing, and growth. However, they each are being made available in open access online so that people not taking the class also can watch these, whichever ones appeal to them. A brief overview of what I'm going to cover in this video lecture. I'm going to begin talking about using poetry to develop empathy abilities. Second, going to talk about receiving poems to facilitate the empathy process, and then writing poems to facilitate the empathy process. This, I think, is a really exciting topic in poetry. It's one of my favorites, and one that is often ignored. I don't think we give enough attention to empathy when we're talking about the various uses and benefits of poetry. So hopefully, through this lecture, you will begin to recognize the powerful potential that poetry holds in regard to empathy. Now, I think a foundational question that we need to talk about, particularly as I say, using poetry to develop empathy skills, is the question about, can empathy be learned or developed? And this is really debated. In my field of psychotherapy, as a psychologist, I've seen this debate many, many times. And there are a lot of people that will just say, you're either an empathetic person or not. But as my hat is kind of tipped here with the title of this being Using Poetry to Develop Empathy Skills, as you can guess, I don't agree with this. As a therapist, I've watched tremendous transformations in individuals who, when they started in therapy, particularly in group therapy contexts, they really did not have much of an ability for empathy. They didn't show many signs of being empathetic at all. And as they went through the therapy process, they became more empathetic. And so I do think there's a number of ways that we can develop empathy, often working through our own issues, our own problems, our own psychological struggles, our own suffering and pain will free us up to become more empathetic. So that's one way that we can become more empathetic and develop empathy skills, is working through our stuff and cultivating a practice of working through our stuff. But I think there are many other ways that we can develop empathy skills, and I'll be talking about that a little bit in connection with empathy in this lecture. Let me start by a topic that may seem a little bit in a different direction. I want to talk about the raging debate that seems to be occurring about the humanities. This is something that has been occurring in the academy for some time, the academy referring to kind of the broader academic community of scholars. It's been happening in the public discourse as well. We've seen increasingly that the humanities have been pushed out of education. This has happened at colleges, it's happened in high schools, even elementary schools. And the shift is more of preparing people for specific careers, specific paths. So education has come to emphasize careers, specific skills, different things that you can put on your vita. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that I think it's obvious and very important that we prepare people for careers and help people develop skills that they're going to need in their careers during their education. That should be a primary objective. But we're seeing that that is becoming the only objective, which really concerns me. This leads to a de-emphasis on things like citizenship, emotional intelligence, though it's not been referred to that all the time. That is more of a new term. And developing relationship skills, compassion skills, skills to be engaged in the world in a healthy way. Now, when I say citizenship, that's really what I'm talking about, is being able to engage the world in a healthy and responsible way, contributing to the betterment of the world. And that is a very important part of education historically, but it's really something that's not being considered so much anymore, which I think is terribly sad. One of the places where this becomes really disturbing is in the development of trade schools. And I'm not saying the trade schools are bad, and certainly are appropriate in some skills and can be a good option. But what these trade schools often do is they focus very specifically on the skills for a specific career. but it doesn't help people get a broader understanding of where that fits into their role as a person contributing to society, as a person who's a part of society. And that's part of what the humanities often can do. They help us develop these other skills, these other abilities that are quite necessary to being a part of the world in a way that's for the betterment of the world. Now, this is not just happening in fields that we think of as more technical fields, such as mechanics and people who work with computers. It's happening even in fields such as psychology. In psychology, we see a lot of trade schools developing up that just train people to be therapists. Now, some of these schools do a very good job of integrating in the humanities and broader perspectives in some different ways. However, some of them are reduced to really just focusing on techniques, skills, and learning the ethics and different things. A very technical type approach to learning. And I think, unfortunately, quite often organizations such as the American Psychological Association really contribute to this. There's a lot of good things that the American Psychological Association facilitates as a leader in the psychotherapy industry and as an organization of psychologists. But quite often it really has moved in a direction of pushing education and training in psychology to being about skills instead of incorporating some of the broader aspects of what it means to be a responsible person who is also a psychologist. So we're seeing some really disturbing trends in this. And the way that I would frame this is I would say that we are growing in knowledge by sacrificing wisdom and compassion. We are growing in knowledge by sacrificing wisdom and compassion. And wisdom and compassion comes through this broader understanding of knowledge, this broader understanding, engagement in the body of knowledge and literature and humanities that are out there. So I think what we really need is balance. It's not that we should just be offering all degrees and nothing but the humanities and then letting people fend for themselves and trying to figure out careers after that. Of course we need to be training people for careers and with specific skills, but we need to balance this with training them to be responsible citizens, with training them in the humanities, and training them in these broader sets of skills. So what does all this have to do with poetry and empathy? Well, poetry and the humanities shape the way that we see, understand, and engage the world. They change them. I think we can see this in a number of different ways. Often people can recognize this with music, that they hear songs at times that motivate them, inspire them, and change the way that they view things. Often because they resonate deeply with it, but sometimes because they're challenged by it as well. The same thing can happen with movies, that watching movies that have a powerful emotional content that help us see the stories and narratives of people can be quite transformative. Stories about history. There's a movie that came out recently, 12 Years a Slave, that had a powerful impact on helping people to understand the history and legacy of slavery. And it changed the way a lot of people understood certain aspects about the realities of the world and how it's come to be, particularly in the United States. There's other movies that have done this in many different other ways. A movie that impacted a lot of people connected to poetry is Dead Poets Society, which is a beautiful example that illustrates what I'm talking about here on a variety of different levels. So poetry and the humanities do have a profound impact on the way that we see, experience, and engage the world. Knowledge and skill without the humanities easily becomes disembodied application of techniques, which is not very effective. Let me give an example of that. I use this example a lot in talking about training psychotherapists and in providing training for psychotherapists. I'll often begin by asking the question, how does it feel when someone uses the technique of empathy with you? Now just think about that for a minute. How does it feel when someone uses the technique of empathy? And what I mean by that is that even potentially in a very skillful way, they use the words with you that many people would connect with empathy. It may not be felt, but they'll use the words. often we can hear the difference. For example, we may hear someone say, "That's really too bad. I'm sorry that happened to you." And we know that this is not really felt or experienced. When people say things like this, but they don't show it, they don't show the experience, often what happens is it creates anger, it creates additional distance, that people will actually feel pushed away. Versus empathy, when someone feels cared for and understood at that emotional level. And empathy is often talked about as stepping out of one's experience into someone else's. So you're experiencing what someone else is experiencing. Different from sympathy, where "I'm sorry that happened," where you're kind of patting them on the back. It's feeling with them. Empathy is when someone's crying and we have our own tears well up in our eyes. This is empathy. Empathy is not just saying the right words. That may be the technique of empathy. And in the medical profession, there was concern being raised about doctors having poor bedside manners, and so they taught acting skills and communication skills to try and help them get better at voicing empathetic statements. And while this may be better than just being detached and uncaring altogether, and was received better than what was experienced often by patients previously, still, it doesn't do the same. It still often even does harm when someone uses this technique of empathy, but it's not sincere, it's not genuine. So poetry and the humanities change how we see and experience the world. When you see a story about racism and the impact that it's had on someone's life, and then you go out and you talk with someone who has experienced racism, often you're going to engage them differently. You're going to have a different appreciation for what they've gone through. Let me give another example that I'm going to come back to a little bit later, the experience of homelessness. Now, this is another thing that's been debated a lot. There are laws going around in the United States right now that are making it more difficult for people to help people who are homeless at times. Laws that basically make it illegal to be homeless by making it illegal to sleep in places, particularly places that are safer for homeless people to sleep. There's efforts to tear down homeless communities, which homeless communities, again, they're another powerful way of keeping each other safe when you're experiencing homelessness. There are places that have made it illegal to give food to people who are homeless. Illegal. You can get a ticket for giving food to a homeless person, which I think is problematic in that it's an infringement on our freedom, for one, but it's also reflective of something that is very troubling in the lack of concern. So we can read all of these statistics and all these different information about the experience of homelessness, but it's not the same as hearing a story, hearing a poem, watching a movie that can help us get in touch with what it's really like, what that experience is really like. That can help transform us a lot more. I think of this a lot with culture and empathy, and this has been one of my big areas of interest, is using poetry to facilitate cultural empathy and using the arts to facilitate cultural empathy and understanding. And when you read facts and historical information and statistics about a culture, and this could be the culture of people who are experiencing homelessness as well, that sometimes will draw up some empathy. And it can be helpful, and it's important to know that. But it's different than watching a movie, reading a poem, hearing an in-depth story about someone's experience. Which do you think is more likely to transform people? Statistics, or something that really helps us understand someone's experience? Well, I believe most of the time it's going to be those things that help us understand someone's experience. We're pretty suspicious of statistics, for one, in our culture today. We hear all kinds of facts, and statistics almost always seem to contradict each other. So we've lost faith in statistics a lot. They can be misused. But also, when we hear statistics, we don't know what it's like, when we hear that there's millions of children that experience hunger on a regular basis because of poverty, we don't imagine what it's like to be hungry in that situation and have nothing that we can do about it. But when we hear someone's story about it, that might change it. So I believe this is why it is so powerful for us to think about poetry and the humanities and getting to this experience and getting to this empathetic level. And we make better decisions when we bring empathy into the picture. Now, I'm not saying that we should make all of our decisions as a society or a therapist even, or in any caring role, based on empathy or just these stories. But that should be one of the pieces of the puzzle. That should be one of the sources of information. It is a way of knowing. It is an epistemology. We can know through the arts in this way. And it's a very, very valuable way of knowing. And I would say an essential way of knowing in a responsible, compassionate society. But it is something that we do not emphasize very much anymore. And the less that we emphasize the arts and the humanities, including poetry, the less that's going to be recognized as a valuable way of knowing that really can help us make a difference. So both facts and stories are important, but each are more valuable when we put them together. So poetry can help us get to that emotional level. It can help us understand the emotional level, and often it can help us even get a bit of that experience, because that's what empathy is again. It's experiencing that level of understanding, experiencing what someone else is feeling. It's reading a poem and being brought to tears because of the story that it tells about someone. And maybe sometimes that's because it resonates with one of our own stories, but quite often it's because it connects with someone else's story, because we now have a picture of what it's like for them to go through this. And it helps us understand facts differently. When we hear that there's millions of children hungry, and we experience it at that cognitive knowledge level, that's one thing. When we hear that, and we get a touch or a taste, a bit of experience of what that may be like coming to mind combined with those facts, particularly thinking about it as a young child who doesn't understand why they are hungry, why they can't have food when there's so many others that do. This changes those facts, the way that we understand them. Poetry adds so much to it. So through this, poetry can open us up to empathy. Now let me talk a little bit about receiving poems to facilitate empathy. One way, and this is probably the most obvious and straightforward way that we can use poetry with empathy, is to invite people to share poems and to receive poems. Really receive them. This can be in therapy, it can be in small groups, it can be in friendship. It can be through modeling by sharing our own. That often when we share our own poem, people will share it back with us. I found this quite a bit as I have talked and presented about poetry over the years, and incorporated poetry into my presentations. That often when I give a lecture and I incorporate a poem into it, then a few days later I'll receive a poem from someone by email, or someone afterwards will come up and share a poem with me. These are amazing gifts. Amazing gifts. Even when the poem is not always that good, it doesn't change how deeply honored I am about it. And as I've said in many of the lectures in this series, poetry, while there is a place for looking at poetry as far as quality, I think we need to understand poetry as something broader than that. Poetry is a sacred healing art that's been used across cultures for much of history. Various cultures have come to it, their own forms of poetry. Poetry should be something of the people. It should not be something that is restricted to being used just by those who have been able to develop a level of poetry writing that they can get published and honored for their poetry. Poetry is for everyone. And when we share poems, we deepen the connection. I've been amazed how often when poetry comes into a room, whether it's my own or someone else or however it comes in, it changes. It feels like the room shrinks, or like we all come together. It's a powerful thing. Writing poetry to facilitate empathy. This is, again, something that is often missed and neglected, unfortunately. Sorry about the typo here. This should be writing about what we experience in others in our own voice. So, writing about how we're impacted when we hear someone's story, but writing it from our own subjective place. This can help with empathy, whether it be coming out of a therapy session as a therapist, whether it be watching a movie, whether it be hearing someone's story, whether it be hearing someone's story in their own poem. Writing something in our own voice about how we were impacted by that can be quite a powerful response that can help us deepen empathy, deepen our compassion for the individuals. So again, writing responses to movies, music, poetry, other storytelling. But then let me mention another one that I think is very powerful. Writing in the voice of someone else. And I would really encourage you to do this. Write in the voice of someone else. Write in the voice of someone who you have trouble being empathetic with. Write in the voice of someone who you have trouble getting along with, that you just can't understand why they treat you the way they do. Maybe that they're angry at you or treat you poorly. Write a poem in their voice. Try and understand what is going on. This can be very, very powerful in bringing about deeper empathy for someone. I'm going to close this brief lecture with a poem that I wrote that was in the voice of a person experiencing homelessness. I've never experienced homelessness myself. I've been very blessed in that. And I've never even been threatened where there's anything close to a realistic possibility or likely possibility for me. But yet, as a therapist, I've heard stories of countless people experiencing homelessness. And this always impacted me. But as I wrote this poem, it deepened. Now, when I wrote this poem, it wasn't coming out of fresh off of hearing those stories. I had heard a number of these stories in the past, and then was in a discussion actually in a community where I live in an online chat room of our neighbors that was talking about what many people were concerned about with the homeless problem. And for them, the homeless problem was not that people were homeless, but that they had to deal with people who were homeless. The people who were homeless sometimes would be in parking lots of stores that they went in and made them feel unsafe. That they had to drive by and see people that were homeless. And the assumptions that immediately come with it about that they're dangerous or that they use drugs or all these different things. And that the judgment that it's obviously their own fault that they're homeless. And there are people on a writing campaign asking the city to drive out the homeless from their camps. And I was concerned about this and bothered by this and felt the need to respond to this. And the primary way that I found to respond was through writing this poem, which was in the voice of someone experiencing homelessness, experiencing the judgment that goes along with homelessness, with experiencing homelessness, I should say. This poem's called I'll Drink to Judgment. They don't know my story, don't want to, and I no longer want to tell it. I sit by the fire. My new tint is brown. It blends better than the green with the gray and brown background. And I just want to blend into nothingness. My campsite is convenience, not choice. My trees are the streetlights, a spotlight on my humiliation. My lake, the gutter puddles, that I am ashamed to say has been a bath a time or two. The fire is almost out now. I hastily drink so the fear may be gone before the flames. Maybe I'll sleep tonight. Soon they will run us off again, to where I don't know. I'll hide my tent a day or two, then we'll be back, always back, despite the nasty looks as if to cast their shame on us. It's too far to walk those days when our campground has been broken. Hard to find a spot I can walk to where my can may hear enough jingle for a meal that's not secondhand. And there's enough light and passerbys so that the late night visitors are discouraged from coming, or at least staying too long. They too don't want to be seen, for to rob those who have nothing is too low even for most criminals. Yesterday, some kids kicked my can as they laughed out loud. I wondered if they were the same ones who the day before slipped a note inside. "Get a job, you fucking bum." Once I would have been indignant. Now, I just am. As I kept looking to see if a treasure may have been hidden, maybe enough to take the edge off. Back when I still had my dignity, I'd proudly tell my shameful story. Even if they didn't ask, I had to tell it. I wasn't one of them. I was different. I once too had a job, had dreams, even a family. A shameful look for those who did not. But these all went away, and there was no more them, instead us. Sure, I made mistakes too, but I never chose this life, and I never deserved this fate. I used to fight in line at the shelters, go door to door each day, hoping for a job. Later, even just work for a day. Then one day, a handout would do. After a while, no one would hire someone unemployed so long. Soon no one would even look at a man who couldn't afford to shower. I gave in and accepted my destiny. I could barely afford a drink, and hope cost so much more. At first I thought, who could blame a man for taking a drink on a cold night? After being robbed and beaten several times, thrown into the hospital, thrown into jail, I thought, who could blame a man for drinking away a little of the pain? The needles too were tempting. Others fell prey, some before their destiny took hold, others after. But I was too proud and stopped with the drink, except that one stormy night when it was all that could make the rain and cold go away. In the beginning, I kept the drink hidden. Begging as a homeless person is hard enough. To beg as a drunk is unbearable. Everyone assumed the same. I saw the judgment when I took $1. "You're not going to buy a drink, are you?" I used to honor their wish, but when I misplaced my dignity, no honor was left. Now, I drink and I don't feel ashamed. Some days I even ask for a beer. A few laugh and say, "I appreciate your honesty." I laugh with them while they laugh at me. Others just turn away. So I take what I can get, and I'll take what comes with it. The scornful looks, the averted eyes. Yes, judgment. I'll drink to that. So for me, as I wrote this poem, I could feel the shift in empathy, the shift in understanding. I also connected with it in a different way that pushed me to feeling the need to speak out for people who weren't able to speak out for themselves at times, because people wouldn't listen to them. Often people who are experiencing homelessness are presented in a certain way by the media and in other places, that distorts their reality. Now, this wasn't the story of a particular homeless person, but each piece of the story did come from someone. These are the types of realities that, as a therapist working with people experiencing homelessness at times, I heard all the time. So it's not truth in the sense that it was someone's story, but it's truth in the sense that it reflects the stories of many, not particularly, but in the general. It's easy to make the assumption, for example, that people who are experiencing homelessness are homeless because they're drug addicts or because they're alcoholics. And sometimes this is the case. But even there's a reason that drove them to that often, that deserves compassion. But for many others, and this was a story I heard often, the drink and the needles, they didn't come until later. And they came because it was the only way that they could survive the pain. That changes the story for me from what I was told too often when growing up. When I was told you shouldn't give money to people who are homeless, you shouldn't give food to people who are homeless because you're just enabling them. I don't believe that anymore. I've heard too many stories to believe it. But the empathy changes so much, changes the way that I feel. And this poem, for me, has helped change the way that I feel and experience each time I see someone struggling with the experience of homelessness. When I see them on the street, when I drive by them. And it helps me to reach for my wallet more often. It keeps me motivated to, on a regular basis, give to shelters and food banks and other places that support helping people who are experiencing homeless, helping them to find jobs, helping them to find a place to stay, helping them find food. So it's a poem that, for me, deepened empathy and brought with it change. So that concludes this lecture, talking about empathy in poetry. And for me, this is one of the most beautiful and powerful ways that we can use poetry, is to deepen our empathy for the other people that we share this world with. And more than just people, we're developing greater empathy for all with whom we share this world. Thank you.